Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Tonight we are going to slow down together, and we are going to spend some time with something small and quiet and a little strange. It is a thing that happens between people every single day, so quietly that almost no one notices it, least of all the person it happens to. You do not need to know anything about psychology to listen. You do not need to take notes. There is nothing to figure out here, nowhere else you need to be, no part of this you have to remember in the morning. If you drift off before we reach the end, that is not a failure. That is the whole point. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is where you are listening from, let yourself settle in. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day set itself down for a while. Thank you for being here with me in the dark. Let us begin. I want to start with a picture, and I want you to hold it gently, the way you would hold something warm. Imagine a room. Any room. A kitchen with the light left on. A break room at work with the hum of a refrigerator. A group of friends around a table, the plates cleared, the conversation loose and easy. And somewhere in that room there is a person. A good person. A person who works hard and feels things deeply and carries a great deal. And that person is talking about what is wrong. The traffic. The manager. The way things never seem to go right. The way one problem stacks on another. The way the world seems to have made up its mind to be difficult. And here is the thing I want you to notice, the thing that will be the quiet center of everything we talk about tonight. As that person speaks, something is happening in the room that they cannot see. The people listening are not thinking what the speaker imagines they are thinking. They are not gathering around in sympathy, drawing closer, ready to help. Something else is happening underneath the surface, in a place with no words. The room is quietly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to turn away. Not all at once. Not with any drama. No one stands up. No one says a hard word. But the next time there is a decision to be made, the next time someone needs a steady hand or an honest opinion or a person to lean on, the room, without ever quite deciding to, turns towards someone else. And the person who complained the most, the person who was only trying to be honest about how heavy their life had become, becomes the person the room quietly stops turning to. And here is the part that keeps me up at night, the part I find the most tender and the most sad. They will never be told why. No one will ever say it out loud. There is no meeting, no note, no moment where anyone explains. The cost gets paid, and no receipt is ever handed over. That is what I want to sit with tonight. Slowly, kindly, because I think most of us have been on both sides of that room, and I think almost no one has ever had it explained to them gently, without judgment, without being told they are a bad person. You are not a bad person if you complain. Complaining is one of the most human things there is. It is what we do when we are in pain and we want another human being to know it. So please, if any part of tonight ever starts to feel like a lecture, like someone wagging a finger at you in the dark, let that go right now. That is not what this is. This is closer to a candle set on a table, just a little light on something that usually happens in the shadows. Let me say it plainly, the shape of the whole thing, so you can rest inside it. There is a cost you may be paying, quietly, for every complaint you have ever spoken aloud. A cost no one will ever tell you about. And the strange, almost paradoxical truth we are going to walk toward slowly over the next while is this. The person complaining is usually trying to do one very simple thing. They are trying to make the weight a little lighter. They are trying to set some of the pain down by handing a piece of it to someone else. And what actually happens, on a channel they cannot hear, is that they set down a piece of their own standing instead. They are reaching for relief, and they are spending something else entirely without meaning to. And by the end of the night, we are going to find that they often get neither. Not the relief. Not the rescue. We will get to why. We have all the time in the world. But let us begin at the beginning with the strangest part of all. The reason no one ever tells you. Take a slow breath with me first, in and out. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Notice how the bed holds you, how you do not have to hold yourself up right now. Good. Here is why the cost stays invisible. When you say something that lands badly, that lowers you a little in someone's eyes, that person almost never tells you. Think about it in your own life. When was the last time someone said to you, honestly, to your face, the way you just talked about that made me trust your judgment a little less? It never happens. It is one of the great unspoken rules of being human. We simply do not narrate our reassessments of each other out loud. We revise our opinion of a person silently, privately, and we keep it to ourselves. The whole transaction happens behind a closed door in another person's mind, a door you will never be shown. So the complainer keeps complaining, because as far as they can tell, nothing bad is happening. No one flinched. No one objected. The absence of a bill feels exactly like the absence of a cost. But those are not the same thing. And there is a piece of how the mind works that makes this cost heavier than you would ever guess. Researchers who study how we form impressions of other people have found something they summarized in a phrase I find myself thinking about often. The phrase is, bad is stronger than good. A group of psychologists, Roy Baumeister and his colleagues, laid this out in a large review back in 2001, drawing together a great deal of earlier work, and around the same time, two other researchers, Paul Rosin and Edward Roisman, described the same lopsidedness. And what it means is this. In the ledger of how we judge one another, a negative piece of information weighs more than an equal piece of positive information. Not the same. More. A single sour note colours your impression of a person more strongly than several sweet ones. If you meet someone and they do 5 kind things and 1 cruel one, it is the cruel one that sits heaviest, that lingers, that quietly sets the tone. The mind is simply built to give bad news extra weight. It is not fair. It is not something anyone chooses. It is just the shape of the machinery we all carry around behind our eyes. Now sit with what that means for the person complaining in the room. Each complaint is a small negative note, and each one weighs more than it should. It does not just get added to the pile. It presses down harder than its size. So even a person who is warm and generous and only occasionally lets the frustration spill out is putting heavy things on one side of a scale that was already tilted against heaviness. A few complaints do not read as a few complaints. They read, in the quiet arithmetic of the listener's mind, as something closer to a mood, a shape, a defining colour. That is the negativity bias doing its slow, unfair work. And the person on the other end of it feels none of this. To them, they said one true thing about a hard day. To the listener's silent ledger, it landed with the weight of 3. Let us slow down here, because this is the heart of the invisibility. There is nothing dishonest happening in that room. No one is being fake. The complainer is being genuine, and the listener is being kind to their face and honest in their own private mind, both at once. It is not a betrayal, it is just 2 different channels running at the same time. On the surface channel, the words, the nods, the sympathetic sounds. And underneath, on a channel with no sound at all, a quiet, continuous reassessment that neither person ever speaks. We are all doing this, all the time to each other. Reading and being read on a frequency we cannot hear ourselves broadcasting on. There is something almost lonely about it, isn't there? And something worth understanding, gently, so that we are not surprised by our own lives. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice the quiet in the room around you. There is no hurry here. When you are ready, we will continue together. So the impression forms, silently, and it accumulates. But an impression by itself is just a feeling. What does it actually do? Here is where the second half of the invisible cost comes in, and it is the piece that gives the whole thing its shape. There is a body of research on something the scientists call ostracism, which is a formal word for a very old and very painful human experience. Being left out, being quietly excluded. And one researcher in particular, Kipling Williams, built a small, almost innocent little experiment to study it. He called it cyberball. It was, on the surface, nothing at all. A simple computer game where you toss a ball back and forth with two other players. That is the whole game. Throw the ball, catch the ball, throw it back. And partway through, without any announcement, the other two players simply stop throwing you the ball. They toss it only to each other, on and on, as if you had quietly ceased to exist. And here is what Williams found, over and over, across many versions of this study. That tiny, meaningless exclusion, being left out of a pointless game of catch with strangers you will never meet, hurts. It genuinely hurts. People felt the sting of it in a way that showed up as something remarkably close to physical pain. We are wired, deep down, to feel exclusion as a wound. Because for most of the long history of our species, to be excluded from the group was not a small social bruise. It was a matter of survival. To be left out was to be left behind. Now hold those two findings side by side, gently, and watch what they do together. On one side, the mind gives negative information extra weight and builds a quietly heavy impression of the person who brings it. On the other side, we instinctively withdraw from sources of persistent unpleasantness, and we are built to do the withdrawing quietly, without confrontation, without a scene. Put those together, and you have the exact machine that produces the thing our title is about. The quiet withdrawal. The room turning away. Not out of cruelty. Not because anyone is a villain, simply because the mind builds a heavy impression, and then the body, following that impression, begins, ever so softly, to keep its distance. The invitations thin out. The seat next to you at lunch fills a little less often. Your name comes up a little less when good things are being handed around. And every bit of it happens without a single word of explanation, because that is how withdrawal works. It is made of absences, and you cannot see an absence. You can only eventually notice that something that used to be there is gone, and wonder, quietly, why that is the cost no one will ever tell you about. It is paid in someone else's private reassessment, and it is collected in the small subtractions of an invitation not made, a confidence not shared, a turn not taken toward you. There is no bill, there is no bad review, there is just a slow, silent drift, and by the time you feel the cold of it, the reasons are long buried, and no one remembers them clearly enough to explain, even if they wanted to. I told you this would be a tender one. Let me say something here, because I do not want you to lie there, feeling the cold of it and nothing else. If you have ever been the person in that room, and I think most of us have, please understand. You were not doing anything wrong in the way a person does something wrong. You were doing something deeply, understandably human. You were in pain, and you wanted to be near other people while you carried it. That is not a flaw. That is one of the oldest and most decent instincts there is, the instinct not to be alone with a hard thing. What we are looking at tonight is not a moral failing, it is a mismatch. A gap between what you meant and what got received, between the channel you were speaking on and the channel they were listening on. And gaps like that can be understood. And things that can be understood can be gently, slowly, changed, if you ever decide you want to. There is no rush on that either. Not tonight. Take another slow breath. Let this next part come in softly. Because there is a question underneath all of this that I have not answered yet, and it is the most important one. Why? Why does the mind treat complaint this way? Why should a few honest words about a hard day set off this whole quiet machinery of heavier impressions and softer withdrawals? The answer is where the real depth is, and it is going to carry us through much of the night. So let me just open the door on it now, and we will walk through it slowly together. Every complaint, it turns out, is secretly an answer to a question the listener was silently asking without even knowing they were asking it. And the question is this: are you in control of your life, or is your life in control of you? Are you the kind of person things happen because of, or the kind of person things happen to? Sit with that for a moment, because when you complain, you are almost never just reporting a fact. Listen to the actual grammar of complaint, the shape of the sentences. They did this to me. This always happens to me. There is nothing I can do about it. Why does it have to be like this? Notice what all of those sentences have in common. In every one of them, the speaker is not the one acting. The speaker is the one being acted upon. The world does, and the speaker receives. The traffic did this to me. The manager did this to me. Life did this to me. The self, in the language of complaint, is always the object of the sentence, never the subject. Always the one on the receiving end of the verb. There is a name for the thing that language is quietly broadcasting. It comes from a psychologist named Julian Rotter, who introduced the idea back in 1966, and he called it locus of control. Locus is just an old word for place, the place where you locate the control over your life. And Rotter noticed that people tend to fall along a line. At one end are people with what he called an internal locus of control. These are people who tend to feel that the outcomes of their lives come, in large part, from their own choices and efforts. The control lives inside them. At the other end are people with an external locus of control, and these are people who tend to feel that what happens to them comes mostly from outside forces. Luck, fate, other people. Circumstances, powers beyond their reach. The control lives outside them, in the hands of the world. And here is the quiet, involuntary thing that complaint does. Complaint is grammatically, structurally, almost helplessly, the language of an external locus of control. They did this to me is a sentence that places the control outside. There is nothing I can do is the external locus stated almost as a creed. You do not have to believe you are powerless for your words to announce it. The complaint carries the message on its own, underneath whatever you actually feel, in the very shape of the sentence. And the listener, who is quietly asking, are you in control of your life, or is it in control of you, hears the answer loud and clear, on that silent channel, whether you meant to send it or not. The complaint says, over and over, in 100 small ways, it is in control of me. I am the one it happens to. Now here is why that answer matters so much more than it seems like it should. Because the question the listener is asking is not, idle curiosity. It is one of the oldest questions our social minds are built to answer about everyone we meet all the time. Who here is worth deferring to? Who here has their hands on the wheel of their own life and might therefore be worth following, worth trusting, worth staying close to? We are, all of us, constantly and unconsciously sorting the people around us by exactly this. And a person who broadcasts again and again that the world is in control and they are merely the thing it happens to, is broadcasting the one signal that our deep social machinery is built to quietly step back from. Not to punish, just to step back from, to not follow, to not hand the wheel to. That is the status decode, and we are only just beginning to open it up. But I want you to have the core of it before you drift, because everything else tonight hangs from this one hook. Complaining does not really tell people about your problem. It tells people about your relationship to your problems. The content, the traffic, the manager, the weather, the unfairness of it all, that is almost beside the point. What gets received on the channel that actually matters is the posture underneath the content. And the posture that chronic complaint keeps striking over and over is the posture of the one without the control, the object of the sentence, the one it all happens to. Let us pause here for a moment. That was a lot to carry, and I do not want you carrying it tightly. Take a slow, deep breath, feel the air come in, and feel it go. Notice, if you can, that you are safe right now. Nothing is being asked of you. You are simply lying in the dark, letting some old human truth turn over slowly in your mind, and that is enough. When you are ready, we will go on. There is no hurry at all. I want to come back, before this first part of the night is done, to the person in the room. The good person. The one who works hard and feels deeply and carries too much. Because I do not want to leave them as a cautionary tale. I want to stay tender toward them because I think most of us are them, at least sometimes. Picture them again. They are not scheming. They are not weak. They are tired. Something in their life has grown heavy, and the weight of it has started to spill out into their words, the way water finds the lowest place. They are not trying to lower themselves in anyone's eyes. The thought would horrify them. They are trying, in the only way they know, to be less alone with a hard thing. And that instinct, to reach for other people when the weight gets to be too much, is not a bug in the human design. It is one of the truest features of it. We were never meant to carry the heavy things entirely by ourselves. So please, as we go deeper on the nights ahead, hold this alongside everything else. The problem was never that they felt too much or wanted comfort. The problem, if we can even call it that, is only that there is a difference, an enormous and mostly invisible difference, between the channel that gives comfort and the channel that costs standing. And almost no one has ever had that difference explained to them, gently, in the dark, with no one grading them for it. We will explore that difference slowly. We will look at the two ancient routes to standing among other people, and why complaint travels neither of them. We will look at what happens in the body and the voice when a person complains, the small signals they leak without knowing. We will look at whether venting even works, whether the person spending their standing is at least buying real relief with it. And the answer, when we get to it, is going to surprise you. We will gently take apart a claim you have almost certainly heard, the one about complaining and your brain, and we will find the honest truth underneath the myth. And then, near the end of it all, we will arrive at the turn, the good turn, the part that makes all the rest worth understanding. Because there is a kind of complaint that actually raises a person's standing rather than lowering it, and almost no one uses it. And there is a way to set down the heaviest things you carry that gives you real relief and costs you nothing, and it is close to the opposite of what most of us do by instinct. And there is a quiet paradox waiting for us at the far end of the night. One I will only whisper now so it can sit in the back of your mind while you sleep. Say less about your troubles, and people take them more seriously. Say more, and they slowly stop hearing them at all. But all of that is for the parts still ahead. For now, in this first quiet stretch, I only want you to hold 3 small things, loosely, the way you would hold something you do not have to keep. The first is that there is a cost to complaint that is paid in silence, in the private reassessments of the people around you, and it is a cost you will almost never be told about, because we do not narrate our judgments of each other out loud. The mind gives the negative extra weight, more than it deserves, and so the cost is heavier than it looks, and then the quiet withdrawing begins. Made of absences you cannot see until they have already added up. The second is that the reason this happens is not that complaint is ugly or negative in some shallow way. It is that complaint answers a question the listener is always silently asking. Are you the one in control? Or is your life the thing in control of you? And the grammar of complaint, the shape of its sentences, keeps answering that question the same way. It keeps placing the control outside, in the world, and the self in the position of the one it all happens to. And the third thing, the one I most want you to fall asleep holding, is the gentlest of the 3, that none of this makes the person who complains a lesser person. It makes them a human being who was reaching for comfort on a channel that happened to carry a cost. And a thing like that can be understood. And once it is understood, it can be met with kindness, both toward the people around us and toward ourselves. You are not broken if you have complained. You are not low if you have felt low and said so. You are simply someone learning, slowly, in the dark, how a very old and very quiet thing works. And there is no shame anywhere in that. There is only the small, warm light of understanding set on the table, showing you something that was always there. So let the picture of that room soften now. Let the good, tired person in it be forgiven, because they were only doing what people do. Let the whole thing loosen and go a little blurry at the edges, the way things do right before sleep. Take a slow, deep breath with me. In, all the way, and let it go, all the way. Feel how little you have to do right now. The question of who is in control of your life can wait until morning. Tonight, nothing is in control of you, and nothing needs to be controlled by you. There is just the dark, and the quiet, and the slow turning over of an old idea, and the warmth of the bed, and the sound of one voice keeping you company while the day lets go of its grip. We have only just opened the door on all of this. There is so much more waiting, and we will get to all of it, slowly, with all the patience in the world. But we do not need any of it yet. For now, we can simply rest here, at the threshold, having seen the first quiet piece of the whole picture. The room that turns away without a word. The cost with no receipt. The question underneath every complaint. And the person in the middle of it, who was never wrong to want comfort, only unaware of which channel it travels on. Stay with me, let your breathing go slow and even. And when you are ready, we will continue together, deeper into the quiet, toward the 2 old paths of human standing, and the reason complaint walks neither of them. There are two ways a human being can stand above others in a group. Two paths. Two entirely different architectures of standing. The first is dominance. Dominance is what it sounds like. It is the standing that comes from being large enough, or frightening enough, or powerful enough that others move out of the way. It is the standing of the animal who bites. The wolf at the center of the circle, not because anyone chose to put it there, but because the alternatives were too costly to try. People obey a dominant person, not because they want to be near that person, not because they want to learn from them or be seen with them, not because they are drawn to them, but because the cost of not obeying is too high. Dominance is purchased with fear. It is maintained with threat. And the moment the threat is gone, or the moment someone more threatening arrives, dominance collapses. There is something cold and fragile at the center of dominance. The second path is prestige. Prestige is given, that is the important word. It is not taken, not extracted, not held in place by the implied weight of a fist. It is given freely, by others, to a person they see as worth learning from, worth staying near, worth copying. Joseph Henrich and Francisco Gil-White, two researchers who studied how human status actually works across cultures, described prestige in 2001 as a distinctly human kind of status, one that may have evolved alongside our capacity for learning from each other, for passing skill and knowledge across generations. A prestigious person is someone whose attention you want, whose judgment you trust, whose presence makes you feel like you might become better just by being in the room. You give them your deference not because they demanded it, but because it feels natural, even advantageous. You lift them up, in a sense, because lifting them up lifts something in you too. Prestige is warm at its center. And the difference between the two matters enormously, because they are read differently. They feel different from the inside. They look different from across a room. And they are built from different materials. Thomas Cheng, Jessica Tracy and Joseph Henrich, along with Tom Folsham and Alan Kingstone, published research in 2013 confirming what most of us feel intuitively, that people track prestige cues and dominance cues through distinct channels, and that they respond to them in different ways. Prestigious people get looked at more, listened to more, deferred to more, not because of threat, but because of a kind of gravitational pull. They are chosen. Dominance is imposed from above. Prestige rises from below. Now here is the thing about complaining, the thing we are slowly turning over together in the dark tonight. Chronic complaining signals neither. It cannot signal dominance, because dominance requires the appearance of power. And a person who tells you repeatedly that things are being done to them, that they are at the mercy of circumstances, that events keep arriving uninvited and unwelcome and outside their control, that person is not broadcasting power. They are broadcasting its absence. The dominant creature does not catalogue its wounds. The wounded creature catalogues its wounds. And it cannot signal prestige, because prestige requires that others see in you something worth learning from, worth copying, worth keeping near. What does chronic complaint model? What skill does it demonstrate? What does it teach? It teaches, at best, the particular vocabulary of a particular grievance. It models how to narrate your own helplessness. And that is not something anyone is lining up to learn. So the chronic complainer falls into an uncomfortable gap. Not frightening enough to command through dominance. Not admirable enough to draw through prestige. Somewhere in between, which is the place human status systems find most difficult to categorize, and the place that tends, over time, to produce what we named last time, the quiet withdrawal, the turned back, the reason no one says anything, the cost with no receipt. Let that land softly. You do not need to do anything with it tonight, just let it be true in the quiet. The question underneath it, the one researchers have been circling for decades, is what exactly complaint is broadcasting, linguistically, grammatically, at the level the listener reads without meaning to. And the answer to that question comes from a man who spent most of his career thinking about something deceptively simple. Where do you think your life lives? Julian Rotter was a psychologist who spent many years in the mid-20th century thinking about a single question, which he turned into a formal framework in 1966. The concept is called locus of control. The word locus is Latin. It means place, location, and Rotter was asking, where do you locate the control over what happens in your life? Where does it live in your mind? Inside you or outside? An internal locus of control means you fundamentally believe that your choices, your effort, your actions shape what happens to you. Not perfectly, not absolutely, but meaningfully. The outcomes of your life are, in important ways, yours to affect. An external locus of control means you fundamentally believe that what happens to you is shaped by forces outside yourself. Fate, luck, other people, the system, the circumstances. Things arrive, things happen to you. The world acts on you more than you act on the world. Now, neither of these is a fixed personality trait, immune to change, stamped on you at birth. Rotter understood that. People move on this continuum. Different domains of life can feel more internal or more external. A person might feel very internal about their work and very external about their relationships, or vice versa. The locus is not a sentence. It is more like a posture, one that can shift. But here is what matters for us tonight. The language of chronic complaint is grammatically external. Listen to the way a complaint is typically structured. Things happen. Something is done. People do things. The weather is awful. The commute was impossible. Nobody listens. Everything falls apart. There is nothing I can do. It always ends up like this. This keeps happening. They never seem to understand. I just cannot catch a break. Notice where the subject of those sentences lives. Not with the speaker. The speaker is the receiver of the action, the object that events land on, the person to whom things happen. Grammar is not neutral. Grammar is a map of how someone sees causality. And the map of chronic complaint puts the speaker at the mercy of everything else, which is a precise, grammatically readable broadcast of an external locus of control. Listeners read this map, not consciously, not with a clipboard and a checklist. They read it the way you read a person's face before they speak, the way you know something is wrong in a room before you can say what it is. The brain is doing its quiet assessment, running its old, deep pattern, matching, the kind that does not wait for a considered opinion. And what it finds, in the grammar of chronic complaint, is this person sees themselves as acted upon. This person attributes outcomes to forces outside themselves. This person is not, by their own account, in control. And here is where the status decode happens. A prestige system is a learning system. You grant prestige to people whose choices and judgments seem worth adopting, because it was adaptive, because our ancestors who learned from the competent survived at higher rates than those who did not. Prestige is the marker your nervous system looks for before it decides to copy someone, trust someone, follow someone. And one of the primary signals of who is worth following is, can this person navigate circumstances, or are circumstances navigating them? The chronic complainer has answered that question, over and over, in small increments, with every repeated narration of hardship not handled, they have answered it. And the answer, assembled slowly, without anyone meaning to assemble it, is this person is not navigating, this person is being navigated. That is the status cost, that is the specific flavour of it. Not that they are unpleasant, not merely that they lower the mood, but that they are communicating through the deep channel of locus of control language that they are not the kind of person the room should look to. Not a model worth copying, not someone in whom control lives. And the saddest part of it, the thing we named at the very beginning of this quiet night together, is that the person in the middle of it almost never hears any of this. Because no one says it. People do not walk up to a chronic complainer and say, "You know, the way you talk about your difficulties signals low agency to me, and I have been quietly revising how much I trust your judgment." People do not say that. They feel something like it, in a vague, non-verbal, unlabeled way. They notice they feel a little heavier after talking with this person. They notice they feel less inclined to ask for their advice, less likely to bring them into a decision, less eager to be in the room. And they might explain this to themselves in a dozen different ways, or they might not explain it at all, just act on it, slowly, quietly, without confrontation. The door just stops opening quite as wide. So the complainer keeps going. They do not know. There is no feedback. The cost is paid in secret, in the small revisions of others' private assessments. And the complainer is not invited into those assessments, and could not read them even if they were. Breathe with me here for a moment. In, long, and out. Let the body settle. You have just heard something true, and true things can sometimes land with a little weight. So let the weight arrive gently, the way you would set something fragile on a table. You do not have to carry it. You just have to let it be there. And if something in you is wondering whether this applies to you, whether this is your story, whether you are the person in the room, know that the wondering itself is already different from what we are describing. The awareness is already the first step away from the pattern. We will talk about all of that. We will talk about what to do and what the alternative actually looks like and why it is not what you might fear. There is nothing here that requires you to become cold or false or relentlessly cheerful in a way that exhausts you. The answer is gentler than that. We will find it together. But for now, the picture we are drawing is not finished. There is another layer underneath the locus of control, one that goes even deeper, and it lives in the body and the nervous system and in one of the most quietly devastating patterns researchers have ever documented. Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer did not set out to discover something about complaining. They were studying something else entirely, the relationship between experience and behavior, between what happens to an organism and what the organism does next. Their experiments, conducted in the 1960s, used dogs and mild electric shocks. The dogs were divided into groups. Some could press a lever to stop the shock. Some could not. The shocks came and went, regardless of what they did. And then, later, both groups were placed in a situation where escape was easy, where all they had to do was jump over a small barrier to get away. The dogs who had been able to control the shocks jumped. They learned the new escape quickly, because their experience had taught them something true. What you do matters. Your action has consequence. The world is responsive to you. The dogs who had had no control did not jump. They lay down. They stopped trying. Even though the escape was right there, simple and available, they had learned something else, something Seligman called learned helplessness. They had learned, at the level of experience, at the level the body knows before the mind has words for it, that nothing they did mattered, that the world was not responsive to their actions. And when the world changed, when control became available, they could not see it. The learning had already happened, and it was deeper than the present situation could reach. Learned helplessness is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is not a character flaw. It is the entirely rational, entirely adaptive response to an experience of uncontrollability. If nothing you do has ever mattered in a particular domain, stopping the effort is the intelligent response. It is the nervous system, doing its job, conserving its resources for something that might actually work. But chronic complaining rehearses that lesson. This is the piece that no one talks about, and it is worth holding carefully. When you say repeatedly in the grammar of external locus, "There is nothing I can do," this keeps happening, nobody listens, it always ends up like this. You are not simply describing your circumstances, you are rehearsing a belief. You are practicing the neural pathway, the language-body groove. Of my actions do not matter here. You are, in a small but real way, teaching yourself the thing the dogs were taught, not by experience alone, but by the repeated verbal enactment of the experience. Language is not just a description of reality. It is also, in part, a rehearsal of it. The story you tell, told often enough, becomes the territory your nervous system expects to navigate. And the story of chronic complaint is, at its core, the story of a person for whom the territory keeps defeating them, keeps surprising them with its hostility, keeps arriving with its arm raised. This is why the learned helplessness frame matters for our purposes tonight. Not because complaining is the same as inescapable shocks. It is not. But because the linguistic pattern of chronic complaint is also the linguistic pattern of helplessness, and the rehearsal of that pattern, over time, does something to how a person holds their own agency. The complaint does not just signal low control to others, it practices low control in the self. And listeners catch this too. Not the theory of it, the feel of it, the sense that a person has, somewhere in them, given up expecting to affect things. People can feel that quality. It arrives in tone, in the particular flatness of a repeated narration, in the way the story ends always in the same place, not with a plan, not with a question, not with a hand extended toward what might be different, but with the period of inevitability. It happened. It always does. And they can't change it. That feeling, even when no one names it, even when it is not examined for even a second, is part of what the room is receiving, part of what is being quietly assessed and quietly weighted in the slow, invisible calibration of trust and deference and standing. Take a slow breath. Let the image of that dog find some peace. He did not know what he had learned. He lay down, because lying down was all his experience had left him. There is compassion in that picture, and it belongs in our conversation tonight. Because the question is not one of blame. The question is one of seeing. Now let us come to the last piece of this particular picture, because it may be the most quietly unfair of all the things we are looking at. The thing that is most outside anyone's conscious choice. The thing that happens between people without a single deliberate decision on either side. Elaine Hatfield, John Cacioppo. And Richard Rapson published work in 1993 on a phenomenon they called emotional contagion. The idea is almost distressingly simple once you hear it, because it was always there and you were already familiar with it, just without the name. Emotions move between people. They travel. They are, in the deepest sense of the word, contagious, not through any deliberate act of communication, but through a set of automatic, involuntary processes that run underneath conscious experience, faster than thought, older than language. You have felt this. You have walked into a room where something silent is wrong and known it before anyone spoke. You have sat next to someone on a bench who was radiating calm and found your own shoulders dropping, your own breath slowing, without deciding to. You have laughed in a room where laughter was catching, not because the joke was funny to you, but because the laughter itself was contagious, and your face moved before you told it to. This is emotional contagion. The mechanism runs primarily through mimicry. We automatically, unconsciously, subtly mirror the facial expressions, the posture, the vocal tone, the breathing rate of the people around us. And the extraordinary thing, the part that Hatfield, Cacioppo, and Rapson spent years documenting, is that this mimicry feeds back into our own emotional experience. It is not just that we copy a sad face, it is that copying the sad face produces something like sadness in us. The body does not distinguish as cleanly as we might like between expressing an emotion and feeling it. So when someone in your vicinity is in distress, when their face carries the particular set of tensions that distress produces, when their voice carries its particular flattening, its particular frequency of complaint, you begin, at a level beneath your choosing, to carry some of that distress too. Your face starts to move in that direction. Your nervous system starts to resonate at that frequency. You begin to feel, a little, what they feel. And here is the unfair part. People do not like feeling worse. This is not a moral failing. It is a preference so basic it barely counts as a preference. It is just the organism moving away from discomfort and toward ease. And so the listener, who has just been made to feel a little heavier without knowing exactly why, begins, slowly, gradually, without deciding to associate that feeling of heaviness with the presence of the person who was there when it arrived. This is not a logical process. The listener does not think, that person made me feel bad, and now I am choosing to like them less. It does not happen in language at all. It is pre-linguistic. It is the body's simple arithmetic. I feel worse in this direction, therefore I will tend not to go in this direction. The same way you might start to find a particular food less appealing after one bad experience that had nothing to do with the food itself. The association is made without a verdict. The verdict comes later, if it ever comes at all. Usually it does not come, it simply becomes preference. So the room that grows quieter around a chronic complainer is responding in part to this mechanism. The people in the room are not sitting there thinking about status, about locus of control, about learned helplessness and prestige signals. They are just feeling something, a slight heaviness, a gentle wish to be elsewhere, a small tightening at the approach of the familiar conversation. And they respond to that feeling the way anyone responds to any feeling, by moving, slowly and without drama, in the direction of its relief. The chronic complainer does not know. There is no feedback. The room gets quieter, the invitations thin out, the conversations stay shorter. And the person in the middle of it, still carrying whatever real and legitimate difficulty prompted the complaining in the first place, now carries it more alone, which, in a cruel irony, gives them more to complain about. The mechanism tightens around itself like a knot, and the mood drop, the feeling of heaviness that the room experiences, gets pinned in the room's wordless assessment on the person who was there when it arrived. Not as an accusation, not as a judgment anyone would say out loud, just as an association, a weight that seems to come with a particular person, a version of the world that feels slightly more difficult in their vicinity. This, too, happens below the threshold of what anyone notices or names. So the complainer is, in this sense, paying three costs simultaneously. The first, the status cost, the broadcast of external locus, of low agency, of a person not in control of their own circumstances. Read through the status channels of dominance and prestige and found wanting in both. The second, the rehearsal cost, the repeated verbal practice of helplessness, which tends to deepen the groove of helplessness in the speaker's own experience, making it harder over time to hold a sense of genuine agency, making the world seem more uncontrollable, which produces more to complain about. And the third, the contagion cost, the mood that travels without consent from the complainer to the room, and the quiet, unlabeled, entirely unfair way the room then associates that mood with the complainer's presence. None of these are punishments. None of them are fair, in the way we usually mean fair. No one decided to implement them. They are just the mechanics, the way the nervous system works, the way the social organism operates, the old machinery running in the walls of every room where two or more people have ever gathered. And now that we have seen them, laid out in the quiet, we can begin to see why the title's observation is true. Not because complaining is ugly or morally wrong. Not because the people in the room are cruel or judgmental, but because of the way these mechanisms run. The status signal, the locus of control broadcast, the helplessness rehearsal, the emotional contagion. All four of them operating simultaneously, invisibly, producing the same result from different directions. The person who complains most is the person the room quietly stops turning to, and they will never be told why. But there is something else. Something that the research and the history of the people who have thought most carefully about this actually point toward. Something that turns this picture from bleak to not easy, but workable. Livable, human in a way that does not require you to stop being human. Because the question you are probably sitting with, whether you are almost asleep or still very much awake and listening, is, if not that, then what? If the room goes quiet and the status cost accumulates and the helplessness deepens and the mood travels, if all of that is the cost of expressing difficulty publicly and repeatedly, then what is the alternative? Silence? Performance? A face that shows nothing, and a voice that pretends everything is fine? We will get to that. It is the heart of everything. It is the peace the title has been building toward since the first moment, and it is the peace that changes the whole shape of the question. But let it wait. Just a little longer. Let your body use this pause. Let the material we have covered tonight arrange itself somewhere quieter than the thinking mind. Somewhere it will still be there in the morning, not as a lecture you attended, but as a thing you simply know. The way you know your own breath. The way you know when a room has shifted. We have named the two paths of human standing, the old ones, the ones built into us so long ago that they feel like instinct, dominance which demands, prestige which earns. And we have seen, carefully and without judgment, why chronic complaint cannot walk either of them. We have looked at Julian Rotter's map of where control lives and heard the grammar of complaint read by every listener who never knew they were reading it. External, acted upon, in the hands of everything else. We have sat with Seligman's dogs, and the quiet, devastating truth about what repeated uncontrollability teaches, and about how the language of chronic complaint rehearses that lesson in the speaker day by day, complaint by complaint, until the groove runs very deep. And we have felt, or perhaps remembered feeling, the reality of emotional contagion. The way mood travels between bodies without permission, without language, without anyone meaning for it to happen at all. And the way the room, made heavier without knowing why, begins its slow and silent movement toward elsewhere. This is the picture so far. The full picture is coming. And it is not a dark one, in the end. There is something genuinely useful in it, something that respects the reality of difficulty, that does not ask you to pretend or suppress or perform a cheerfulness you do not feel. The researchers and the ancient thinkers and the careful clinicians who have thought longest about this question all arrive at roughly the same place, from different directions. And it is a gentler place than you might expect. So let your breathing go slow and even. Let the dark be dark, and the quiet be quiet, and the bed be exactly as warm as it is. There is no hurry in any of this. No exam to pass, nothing to retain, nothing to do with any of it before morning. The understanding is already settling in you, wherever understanding goes. You do not have to find it or hold it. It will simply be there, the way water finds its level without being told. Stay with me. Let your eyes stay where they are. Let your body be heavy in all the right places. There is still more to find in the quiet, the catharsis that does not work the way we think it does, and the distinction that changes everything. And the paradox at the center of it all that might, when you finally hear it, seem as obvious as breathing and as surprising as suddenly understanding a joke you heard years ago. All of it is waiting, patiently, just a little further along in the dark. We will get there together. There is a belief that most of us carry without ever having examined it. It lives somewhere just below the level of conscious thought, comfortable and unquestioned, the way furniture lives in a room you have walked through so many times you have stopped seeing it. The belief is this, that when something is hurting you, when an emotion has built to the point of pressure, the natural and correct response is to let it out. To express it, to say it aloud, to someone, or into a pillow, or at the ceiling. To vent. The belief is ancient. It predates modern psychology by centuries. It runs through folk wisdom in almost every culture. Hold it in and it will poison you. Let it out and you will be lighter. Even the word we use for it, venting, is a mechanical image. A pressure system with a release valve. Block the valve, and the thing explodes. Open it, and the pressure equalizes. The metaphor is so physical, so intuitive, that we have essentially never questioned it. And then, someone decided to test it. In 2002, a psychologist named Brad Bushman, working at Case Western Reserve University, set out to examine whether venting actually did what everyone had always assumed it did. Whether releasing anger outwardly, expressing it, giving it a physical channel, made people calmer, or more agitated, less aggressive, or more. The study was careful and controlled. Participants were made to feel genuinely angry. They were given an essay to write, and then told, falsely, that a stranger had read it and found it poor work. Evaluative criticism from a stranger, delivered in writing. If you want to produce real irritation in a laboratory, that method reliably works. Then the participants were divided. One group was told to sit quietly, doing nothing, for 2 minutes. Another group was given a punching bag and told to use it, to hit it, physically, while thinking about the person who had criticized their essay. To let it out. To vent. The conventional prediction, the one the catharsis theory would make, was that the punching bag group would feel better afterward, calmer, discharged, that the physical expression of the anger would function like the release valve the metaphor promises, and that the quiet group, having suppressed their feelings, would carry more irritation into whatever came next. The results were the other way around entirely. The people who had vented their anger by hitting the punching bag while thinking about the person who angered them. They were measurably more aggressive afterward. Not less. When given a subsequent opportunity to deliver a burst of unpleasant noise to the person who had criticized them, the venting group delivered louder noise for longer. The quiet group, the people who had simply sat and done nothing, were calmer, less aggressive, more likely to let it go. Bushman described the findings simply. Venting to reduce anger, he said, is like using gasoline to put out a fire. Let that sit for a moment, like using gasoline to put out a fire. Because the image captures something exact. Gasoline and fire share a relationship. They are connected, chemically intimate, and pouring gasoline near fire does produce a dramatic, visible, energetic response. Something happens. Something is clearly happening. But the fire is not going out. The fire is growing. The gasoline is not the solution, it is fuel for the very thing you are trying to reduce. And this is what the venting group discovered, though they did not know it in those terms. The act of expressing the anger outwardly, physically, while keeping the mind focused on the source of the anger, did not discharge the emotion, it rehearsed it. It gave the nervous system more practice at being angry. It ran the anger through its paces again and again, like a musician drilling a difficult passage, making it more fluent, more automatic, more available the next time the conditions for it arose. Emotion, in this sense, is not a substance you can pour out of yourself. It is more like a habit, more like a pattern your nervous system knows how to run. And the way you strengthen a pattern is by running it, by practicing it. Venting does not empty the pattern, it exercises it. This matters enormously for what we have been exploring together tonight, because one of the things that makes chronic complaining so sticky, so hard to step away from, is that it feels like relief. In the moment of complaint, there is something that resembles release. You said the thing that was pressing on you, and for a brief interval, the pressure feels lighter. And so the brain files that experience under. This worked. This helped. Come back here when the pressure builds again. But what Bushman's study suggests, and it is one study, one data point, to be weighed carefully, is that the relief may be an illusion. Or at least that the rehearsal happening underneath the relief may be doing more lasting work than the momentary lightness. The person who chronically complains is not only spending a form of social currency they cannot easily replenish. They are also, quite possibly, training themselves to feel the distress more readily, more intensely, for longer. The complaint is both the symptom and the practice that deepens the symptom. Double cost. No receipt. Let your breath go long and slow. The room, wherever you are, is still and dark. You are still and warm. These ideas are passing through you the way all ideas do, in the dark, gently, without urgency, without any demand that you act on them or solve anything. There is nothing to solve tonight. Only to hear. and then to rest. There is another piece of this, one that feels more complicated because it sits right next to something real and good. It involves friendship. It involves the reason that talking about your problems with someone you trust feels like intimacy. Why it feels like closeness, like being known, like belonging. Because it is. That part is true. In 2002, a developmental psychologist named Amanda Rose, studying friendships, especially the friendships of adolescent girls, identified a pattern she called co-rumination. The word means, roughly, to chew on something together. Two people sitting with a problem, turning it over, examining it from different angles, feeling it out loud with each other. Taking a difficulty that one of them carries and passing it back and forth between them until they both know its shape. What Rose found was that co-rumination did produce genuine closeness. The friendships where this happened, where two people regularly and thoroughly discussed their problems together, returned to those problems repeatedly, encouraged each other to talk about the hard things, to keep going, to say more, those friendships were warmer. The people in them reported feeling more understood, more valued, more deeply connected to each other than people in friendships where this pattern was less present. That part was real. The intimacy was not imagined. The sense of being known, which we all need and which is genuinely difficult to come by, was actually there. But here is what else Rose found. The same people, in the same friendships, doing the same co-rumination, they also showed higher rates of anxiety and depression than their peers whose friendships involved less repeated problem discussion. Not lower. Not the relief the talking seemed to promise. Higher, the behavior that was building the bond was also, simultaneously, entrenching the distress. The two effects were not in conflict. They were both true, both running in parallel, like two rivers that happen to run in the same direction for a while before they separate. This is not a reason to avoid close friendship or to stop talking to the people you trust. Please do not take it as that. The finding is more specific than that, and more interesting. What it points toward is a question about frequency and function. About whether a given conversation about a difficulty is moving something through, helping to see it more clearly, generating a new perspective, naming it and then moving past it, or whether it is circling back to the same territory again and again, reinforcing the shape of the wound rather than closing it. There is a difference between a conversation that helps and a conversation that rehearses. And the line between them can be thin and hard to see in the moment, especially because the rehearsal conversations feel good while they are happening. They feel like intimacy. They feel like being taken care of. They feel like the other person understands you and cares about your pain, which they do. The feeling is real. The bond is real. But the entrenching is also real, happening quietly underneath the warmth. Co-rumination is, in this way, a kind of trap that wears the clothes of connection. You come for the closeness, and you leave with both the closeness and a slightly more practiced, slightly more grooved version of the difficulty you came in carrying. The relationship is better, the problem is, often, not. And if the problem is not better, you will come back. And the relationship will grow warmer. And the problem will grow more practiced. And the loop continues, slowly, the way all slow loops do, invisibly. The people who have thought most carefully about this, who have tried to understand where healthy processing ends and entrenching rehearsal begins, tend to come back to the same distinction again and again. And that distinction is one we will come to fully in a little while. For now, let it be a question hanging lightly in the air the way a good question should, not demanding an answer, just opening a space. Is this conversation moving through or moving in circles? That is enough of a question for the moment. Let it rest there. Let your body rest where it is. Take a slow breath in and let it out. Notice the quiet that comes after a breath released. That small, exact quiet between one breath and the next. It does not last long. It never does, but it is there, reliable as the dark. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier. Energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is something you have almost certainly heard before. You may have heard it as a fact, stated with the confidence that viral information tends to accumulate as it travels. That complaining, not just chronic stress, not just sustained unhappiness, but complaining specifically, causes physical damage to the brain. Shrinks it, kills neurons, destroys the hippocampus. The claim tends to arrive with the name of Stanford attached, or sometimes the name of Robert Sapolsky, who is a genuine and eminent researcher at Stanford whose work on stress and the body is careful and important and real. Or sometimes it arrives via a book called 3 Simple Steps by an author named Trevor Blake, who relayed a popular version of the idea. You may have seen it in an article, or heard it in a podcast, or read it in a listicle, stated as though it were settled neuroscience. It is not. It is important to say that clearly, because the claim is the most shared piece of information on this topic, and sharing it here would make this video one more link in a long chain of content that is confidently mistaken. The specific assertion that the act of complaining itself causes measurable hippocampal shrinkage is not a finding from any study. It is a popularization that overshot the evidence somewhere along the way, like a game of telephone played at the scale of the internet. The specific destination of complaining shrinks your brain is not in any peer-reviewed literature. Here is what Robert Sapolsky's actual work does show, and it is genuinely sobering in a different, more honest way. Sapolsky has spent decades studying the physiology of stress, particularly the effects of sustained, chronic stress on the body and brain. His research, along with a substantial body of related work, has established that prolonged activation of the stress response, the sustained release of glucocorticoids, which are steroid hormones of which cortisol is the most familiar, can have measurable effects on the hippocampus, a region of the brain heavily involved in memory and spatial navigation and certain forms of learning. The hippocampus has an unusually high density of receptors for these stress hormones, which means it is acutely sensitive to them. Under conditions of chronic, unrelenting stress, the kind that persists without relief over long periods. There is evidence of changes in hippocampal structure and function in animal studies, and some corroborating evidence in human studies as well. That is the real finding. Chronic stress, sustained over time, with no sense of control or relief, affecting the brain via glucocorticoid pathways. What it does not say is that complaining as a speech act is the mechanism. What it does not say is that you can trace the hippocampus directly to the words spoken in frustration. The chain from chronic complaint to hippocampal change, if it exists at all, runs through stress as an intermediate, through the lived experience of perceiving oneself as chronically out of control, as powerless, as subject to forces that will not move. which generates and maintains a stress response, which over time and without relief may have physiological consequences. That is a plausible and coherent story. But it is a much longer and more conditional story than complaining shrinks your brain. And the specific mechanism, if any, is not the words themselves, but the state of mind that generates and is reinforced by the words. The distinction matters because it keeps the analysis honest. Because this video is not about frightening you into silence with threats of neural decay. The case against chronic public complaining does not need the dramatic neuroscience claim to stand. It stands perfectly well without it, on the status mechanism and the social cost and the catharsis reversal and the co-rumination trap, all of which are real and documented and apply whether your hippocampus is perfectly fine or otherwise. The honest version of the claim is, in some ways, more useful than the dramatic one. It points toward the state underneath the behavior rather than the behavior in isolation. It points toward the felt sense of powerlessness, of unrelenting circumstance, which is what actually generates the physiological stress and which is what chronic complaining both expresses and rehearses. The words are the symptom and the practice. The stress they embody and reinforce is the deeper channel. And so the honest reading of Sapolsky's real work, the work he actually published and can defend, fits quietly and naturally into everything we have been exploring tonight. Not as a scare, not as a threat, not as a viral claim designed to alarm, as a piece of the same picture, drawn accurately. Let your muscles go a little softer. Your shoulders, if they have risen at all, let them settle back down. Your jaw, if it has held any tension, let it release. You are lying in the dark, and none of this is urgent. None of it will require anything of you before morning. The understanding moves through you quietly, the way warmth moves through a room when someone has thought ahead and left a lamp on for you. You did not have to do anything to receive it. It is simply there, gentle and without demand, and you can let it warm you or let it go. And either is fine. There is one more piece of this section that it would be incomplete to leave out. It is the piece that operates at a level below language, below conscious decision, below the words themselves. Even before a complaint is heard and categorized and evaluated, even before the listener has registered its content, something else is already happening. Something more immediate. Something that the body is broadcasting and the body of the listener is receiving, on a channel that neither of them is fully aware of. Researchers who study social status and communication have found that the way a message is delivered carries enormous amounts of information. Information that in many cases outweighs the content of the message itself. We have always known this colloquially. We know that tone of voice matters, that how you say something is sometimes more important than what you say. But the research is more specific than that, and worth spending a moment with carefully. Vocal pitch, for instance, carries status information that listeners decode rapidly and largely automatically. A voice under tension, slightly higher in pitch than normal, or constricted in quality, or with less control over the variations in pitch that produce the sense of expressiveness, registers differently in the listener's perception than a voice that is low and steady and unhurried. This is not a matter of deliberately choosing a powerful voice. It is a physiological readout. Tension in the laryngeal muscles changes the quality of the sound produced. And tension tends to be present when a person is in a state of distress or activated stress response, which is often the state in which complaint arises and is delivered. The listener hears this. Not consciously, in most cases. Not as a clear thought, this person's voice is tight, therefore they are stressed, therefore I am updating my assessment of their standing. It happens faster than that, and lower, below the floor of deliberate attention. But it happens. The same is true of gaze. We are exquisitely sensitive to where another person's eyes are directed. Downward gaze, in moments of social interaction, gaze that falls away from the other person's face, that finds the floor or the middle distance, carries associations with self-consciousness, uncertainty, reduced assertiveness. Again, this is not a choice. It is something the body does under certain emotional conditions. And it is something the other body reads, also without choosing to read it. Posture carries similar information. The body under distress tends toward contraction, shoulders drawn in, the torso narrowed, the physical presentation of taking up less space versus the open, expanded, relaxed posture of someone who is, in the very body of the moment, not afraid. And the important caution here, because there has been a significant scientific controversy around some of the stronger claims in this area, and it would be irresponsible to overstate, is that the research on specific posture interventions, the claim that adopting a power pose can change your hormones and your outcomes, has faced serious scrutiny. Those specific effect sizes are contested, and the original results have not fully replicated. What does hold up, more robustly, is the directional finding that the non-verbal presentation of confidence and the non-verbal presentation of distress or submission look different, and that observers can read those differences, and that those readings feed into status assessments. Not because it is unfair or judgmental, but because that is how the social processing of status information evolved to work. We were reading each other's bodies for safety and hierarchy information long before we had words to do it in. The words came later. The body reading is older, faster, and less susceptible to conscious control. And here is where it becomes relevant to our evening's conversation. The emotional state in which most public complaining is delivered, activated, distressed, frustrated, feeling subject to forces outside one's control, is precisely the state that tends to produce the non-verbal markers of reduced status. Tighter voice, more variable or downward gaze, contracted posture. These things happen not as performance, but as readout, the body expressing what the nervous system is experiencing. So the listener is receiving the complaint on multiple channels simultaneously. They are hearing the words which tell them that something bad happened and that the speaker did not control it. They are hearing the vocal quality which tells them, in a channel below language, that the speaker is activated and tense. They are seeing the posture and the gaze which tell them, in a channel older than language, about the speaker's felt sense of their own standing in the world. All three channels are saying the same thing, and they are saying it continuously, and most of it is happening below the threshold where either person can name or contest it. This is part of why the status assessment is so hard for the complainer to argue with or recover from in the moment. If a friend says to you directly, "You seem distressed and out of control," you can respond. You can offer evidence to the contrary, context, a competing narrative. Language can be argued with. But the vocal quality and the gaze and the posture are not making an argument. They are making a statement in a channel that does not have a debate function. The listener is not thinking, "His voice seems tight, I will now lower my assessment of his status." They are simply already lowering it, automatically, the way you automatically register the weight of something the moment you lift it, without ever deciding to register the weight. This is the invisible part of the invisible cost. Not only is the listener silently updating their sense of who you are in the hierarchy of people worth deferring to, they are doing it through multiple channels at once, the verbal and the non-verbal, and the non-verbal channels are faster and more automatic and less available to conscious correction by either party. The complainer, feeling the distress, expressing it in the voice and body, as well as in the words, becomes a figure that the evolved social brain of the listener reads as, this person is not in control of their situation, and being near this person makes me feel the weight of their situation in my own body, and that is uncomfortable, and I will, quietly, begin to move toward elsewhere. No one decides this. No one chooses it. It is something that happens at a level below choice. Breathe, just breathe, slowly, the way a tide comes in and goes out without being asked. The room is dark and quiet, and you are warm, and nothing about any of this requires anything of you right now. These are old patterns in old systems, doing what they were built to do, long before anyone thought to name them. And naming them does not condemn you. It does not say, you are doing this wrong and you must fix yourself. It says, here is something true, and understanding true things, even when they are complicated, is its own kind of ease. Because once you can see a pattern clearly, it no longer operates on you in quite the same way. It becomes a thing you can look at, rather than a thing you are inside of without knowing it. And what makes all of this worth sitting with, worth hearing in the dark before sleep, is that there is a way through it that does not ask you to suppress or deny or perform a cheerfulness that is not yours. There is a distinction, a real, specific, usable distinction between what costs you and what does not, between the kind of sharing that processes and the kind that performs, between the complaint that raises your standing and the complaint that quietly spends it, between the channel that works and the channel that doesn't, for the feeling as much as for the status. That distinction is coming. It is the thing this whole night has been walking toward, slowly, in the way all worth arriving at things are walked toward slowly. And we are close to it now. You can feel that, perhaps, the way you feel the temperature of a room shift as you move from one part of the house to another. Not dramatically, but definitely, something in the air is different. The pieces that have been arriving one by one are beginning to arrange themselves. The way a picture, assembled from its edges inward, suddenly clarifies. Not all at once, but in a moment when enough of the pieces are in place that the center becomes obvious. Let the pieces rest where they have landed. The catharsis that is not what we thought it was. The co-rumination that is warm and entrenching in the same breath, the stress physiology that is real and serious and not quite the story that went viral, the body that is broadcasting on channels the mouth does not control, all of it pointing from different directions toward the same thing, toward a distinction, toward a way through, and that way through is not discipline. It is not willpower. It is not the gritting of teeth, or the swallowing of feelings, or the performance of a composed face over a churning interior. It is something much older and more honest than any of that. It is understanding which channel you are choosing. And you do not have to understand everything tonight. You do not have to hold all of this in the hands of your mind at once. The mind at night was not made for that kind of holding. It was made for something softer, for letting things pass through, for lying down in the dark and feeling the weight of the body distributed across a surface and allowing, for however many hours remain until morning, the world to be exactly the size of this room, and nothing more. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let your thoughts go slow. The way a stream goes slow when the land it is moving through goes flat and open and stops rushing it anywhere. Let the words dissolve into the dark where they came from. And rest. There is a distinction that most conversations about complaining never quite arrive at. And it is the one that changes everything. Not a technique. Not a challenge where you count the days and move a bracelet from one wrist to the other. Not a discipline of forced positivity layered over genuine feeling the way paint is layered over rot. Something older and more precise than any of that. A distinction that has been sitting inside the research all along, visible once you know where to look, invisible before. Robin Kowalski, a psychologist who spent considerable time studying the actual structure of complaint. Not just the feeling of it, but its architecture, its function, its direction, arrived at something that sounds simple when stated plainly, and is in fact quite radical in its implications. She found that not all complaints are the same thing. They look the same from the outside. They use similar words. They occupy similar social moments. But they are doing fundamentally different work, and they land in completely different ways on the people who receive them. The first kind she called instrumental. A complaint aimed at someone who can do something about the problem. Specific, directed, with an implicit or explicit request attached. The kind of complaint where you go to the person who booked your hotel room and tell them, calmly and with some precision, that the room smells of mildew and you would like a different one. The kind where you tell your colleague that the deadline they set puts you in an impossible position and you need to renegotiate it. The kind where you write the letter to the company, or make the call, or bring the issue to the meeting where the issue can actually be resolved. That kind of complaint, when used well, is a form of agency. It is a demonstration of internal locus of control. It says, in the language beneath the words, I believe that what I do in response to this difficulty will have some effect on the outcome. And that is precisely the signal that listeners and the status systems running beneath their conscious awareness are oriented toward. Competence, agency, the sense that this person knows where the levers are and is willing to reach for them. Instrumental complaint, in other words, does not lower status. Used well, it can raise it. And then there is the second kind, expressive complaint. The kind aimed not at a fixer, but at a witness. Not at someone who can do anything about the problem, but at someone who is simply present. The venting, the repetition, the voicing of distress that loops back on itself, not because there is any expectation of resolution, but because the feeling needs somewhere to go, or seems to. This is not a moral failing. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be witnessed. The desire to be seen in your difficulty, to have someone know what you are carrying, is one of the most human desires there is. It is woven into the social fabric of every culture that has ever existed. We gathered around fires for this. We sat in circles for this. We told our stories to one another across every form of distance the world has put between us. Being witnessed is a need. But the way expressive complaint delivers the feeling of being witnessed repeatedly, publicly, to anyone within range, is the way that creates the costs that this whole night has been circling. Because expressive complaint is the kind that broadcasts external locus. It is the kind that emotionally contagion spreads through a room. It is the kind that the listener receives as noise when it comes too often, and finally as trait, as identity, as that is just how this person is. And once it becomes trait, it no longer registers as a report on a situation. It registers as information about the reporter. Guy Winch, a clinical psychologist who spent years looking closely at this pattern in his practice, wrote about what he called the squeaky wheel. the way people tend to complain in the least effective possible configuration. Not to the person with the power to change things, not once, with a proposed solution attached, but sideways. To the friend who can offer nothing but sympathy, to the colleague who has no authority over the situation, to the family member at dinner who is hearing the same story for the fourth time and who loves you and who is quietly, incrementally, without any intention or malice, beginning to feel a kind of heaviness when your name comes up on their phone. And the cruelty of the situation, Winch noted, is that the person doing this is not getting what they came for. They are not getting resolution. They are not getting the lever moved. They are not even getting genuine relief, as Brad Bushman's experiments at Case Western showed so clearly. The anger, the distress, does not diminish through expressive venting. It rehearses. It strengthens. The groove gets deeper. So the complainer, when they are operating in this expressive, unfocused, repeated mode, is paying in status for a relief they are not receiving, about a problem that is not being solved, to an audience that is quietly and invisibly beginning to reassess their estimation of who this person is. That is a hard thing to sit with. It is also, when seen clearly, a kind of compassion toward the person who has been stuck in this loop. Because they are not doing it from weakness or from selfishness or from any of the things we might lazily reach for as explanations. They are doing it because it feels, in the moment before the empirical result comes in, like something that should work. It should discharge the pressure. It should make the weight lighter. The theory makes sense. The practice, as Bushman's fire and gasoline image captures it, does the opposite of what the theory promises. Understanding that is the beginning of something different. Take a slow breath now. Notice the quiet of where you are. The particular quality of the dark in this room. The way the body, at rest, is already doing the work of settling without being asked to. And when you are ready, we will continue together. What does actually work, then? What does the research point toward when it comes to the genuine processing of difficulty, the kind that does not cost status, the kind that actually addresses the feeling rather than rehearsing it? James Pennebaker spent decades studying a question that sounds simple and turned out to be surprisingly rich. What happens when people write about their most difficult experiences privately for themselves alone? He ran trial after trial across different populations, different difficulties, different circumstances. In the basic version of what became known as the expressive writing paradigm, people would write for 15 to 20 minutes a day, over 3 or 4 days, about whatever emotional experience was most weighing on them. Not for an audience, not in a public space, not as a way of seeking sympathy or witnesses, just onto the page, for themselves, in whatever raw and unpolished form it wanted to come. And what he found, reliably enough that it replicated across studies, was that people who did this showed measurable improvements in mood, in psychological well-being, in some studies in physical health markers, fewer visits to the clinic in the months following the writing sessions, changes in immune markers, better sleep. The private, structured engagement with difficulty was doing something the repeated public venting was not. The mechanism is not entirely settled, and Pennebaker was careful about this. But one interpretation that held up across the work was that the writing was not simply releasing the emotion the way a valve releases pressure. It was doing something more, like organizing it, giving it shape, moving it from the formless, recurring, intrusive loop of unprocessed experience into something with a beginning and a middle and an end. The narrative form itself was doing work that the raw venting was not. The private, structured engagement with difficulty is how feeling actually moves. The repeated public expression of it is how feeling stays. This is the distinction at the heart of everything. Not suppression versus expression, not silence versus speaking. It is about direction, about channel, about who the audience is, and what you are asking of them, and what the act of telling is actually trying to accomplish. Susan Silk, a clinical psychologist, and Barry Goldman, an attorney and mediator, put a version of this into a framework that appeared in the Los Angeles Times in 2013. They called it ring theory. The image is simple: draw a small circle in the center. That is the person most directly affected by the difficulty, the patient who received the diagnosis, the person who experienced the loss, the one closest to the fire. Draw a larger circle around that one. Those are the people immediately around that person, a spouse, a closest friend, a sibling. Then draw another larger circle around that, and another. Each ring holds people progressively further from the center of the difficulty. The rule they proposed is this: comfort flows inward. Complaints, venting, the need to process your own distress about someone else's situation, flow outward. If you are in the third ring and you are upset about what is happening to the person in the first ring, you go to someone in the fourth ring to process that. You go to the first ring to offer, not to take. It sounds obvious when stated plainly. In practice, it is one of the hardest things in the world to hold on to. Because when something painful is happening and we are in its vicinity, our own distress is real and it wants to go somewhere, and the most emotionally available person is often the one who is already carrying the most. Ring theory is not a finding from a controlled experiment. Silk and Goldman were offering a clinical heuristic, a practical framework built from experience. But its logic maps exactly onto what the research around status, emotional contagion, and the functions of complaint had been finding from different angles. Comfort flows toward need. Distress flows away from it, into circles where it can be held by those who have more capacity at that moment to hold it. And embedded in this framework is the same underlying insight that runs through all of it: the difference between processing and performing. Processing asks, how do I move through this? Performing asks, does everyone know that I am in this? Neither question is wrong at its root. The desire to be known in your difficulty, witnessed in it, is not pathological. It is human. But performing, when it becomes the dominant mode, when it becomes the channel through which all difficulty travels, creates the costs this whole night has been examining. The status cost, the relationship cost, the paradoxical emotional cost of deepening the very feeling you were trying to discharge. And there is one more cost that is worth naming slowly, because it is perhaps the most surprising of all. Volume destroys the signal. This is the paradox that the research around negativity bias, around impression formation, around the way listeners actually process what they hear. This is what all of it has been pointing toward, without always naming directly. When distress is frequent, listeners adapt to it. The same psychological mechanisms that make negative information so powerfully weighted in initial impression formation, the Baumeister and Bratslavsky and Finkenauer and Vos finding, the Rosin and Roisman finding, bad is stronger than good, those mechanisms adjust over time when the negative information becomes constant. Imagine the difference between an alarm that sounds once in your building. Once, unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Your entire nervous system attends to it. You look up. You pay attention. You take it seriously, because an alarm that sounds rarely means something rare is happening. Now imagine an alarm that sounds every day, sometimes twice a day, 3 times, every Tuesday afternoon, reliably, around 2 o'clock, and then one Tuesday it sounds because something is actually wrong. You do not rush out of the building on that particular Tuesday. You wait and see. This is what happens to the complaints of a chronic complainer in the perception of the people around them. At first, the disclosure of difficulty is weighted heavily. Negativity bias ensures that a single piece of negative information colors an impression powerfully. But as the frequency rises, as the complaints become a consistent feature of the landscape of being around this person, the brain's noise filtering begins to operate. It starts to classify the distress as ambient, as background, as part of the texture of this relationship, rather than as a signal about a specific situation. And then, when something genuinely serious happens, when the difficulty is real and deep and the person needs to be taken seriously, the signal arrives in a channel that has been training listeners over time to receive it with a fraction of its actual weight. The person who says very little about their suffering and then says something is heard as if through a clear glass. The person who says everything about everything all the time and then says something important is heard through years of accumulated static. Saying less does not make people care less about your difficulties. It makes them hear each difficulty more. It preserves the weight of each disclosure. It keeps the channel clear. And it does something else as well. It signals to the status reading systems running in the people around you that you are someone whose relationship to difficulty is not helplessness, not the external attribution, not the broadcasting of powerlessness, something more like steadiness. And steadiness is the thing prestige status, the freely conferred kind, the kind that lasts, has always been oriented toward. There is a tradition, very old, that understood all of this without the vocabulary of social psychology. Without Baumeister or Kowalski or Pennebaker or ring theory. It arrived at the same place through a different kind of rigor. Epictetus was a philosopher who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and he was, for a significant portion of his life, a slave. His physical circumstances were not a metaphor. They were an ongoing confrontation with the exact question his philosophy would spend itself trying to answer. What is yours? Truly, when almost nothing is yours. His answer, which he set down in a short text known as the Enchiridion, a word that roughly means handbook or manual, begins with a distinction. Some things are in our power, he wrote, and some things are not. What is in our power is our own judgment, our impulse, our desire, our aversion, the inner workings of how we meet what happens to us. What is not in our power is the body, reputation, property, political office, everything that belongs to the external world. This sounds, when you first encounter it, like a counsel toward passivity, like a philosophical resignation. Do not try to change what you cannot change, which sounds fine, and then do not try to change anything at all, which sounds like giving up. But that is not what Epictetus was saying. The dichotomy of control was not a prescription for surrender. It was a precision instrument for identifying where energy is most effectively spent. It was the internal locus of control, named philosophically 2,000 years before Julian Rotter would name it psychologically. The recognition that the only domain in which your effort is fully sovereign is the domain of your own response to what happens. Complaint, in its chronic expressive form, is an investment of energy in the wrong domain. It is directed outward, at the conditions, at the people who created them, at the unfairness of their having occurred at all. It keeps the attention on what cannot be controlled, and in doing so, it rehearses over and over the helpless relationship to the uncontrollable, the Seligman and Meyer pattern, the learned helplessness, the verbal repetition of nothing I do matters until that frame becomes the structure through which new experiences arrive and are filtered. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the 2nd century, a man who was emperor of Rome and spent years in military campaigns and watched his children die, and governed an empire that was always, somewhere, collapsing in some direction, Marcus Aurelius returned to the same territory again and again in the private notebooks that became his meditations. He was not writing for an audience. He wrote it in Greek, possibly so it would not be easily read by those around him. He was processing, in the Pennebaker sense, privately, structuredly, for himself. The very form of the meditations is an argument against performing distress. It is the argument of a man who understood the difference between the channel that holds and the channel that spends. He wrote about waking up and finding resistance in himself to the day, about the desire to linger and complain, and then about the choosing otherwise. Not through denial of the difficulty. He was clear-eyed about difficulty, often brutally so, but through the redirection of attention toward what was in his power. The response, the quality of judgment brought to the moment, the decision about how to meet what had arrived. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." It is a short sentence. It contains the entire architecture of everything this night has been circling. The composure that marks the people who seem to handle everything is not performed. It is not a mask laid over suppressed feeling. It is not the denial of pain or the pretense of ease. It is the understanding of which channel the pain belongs on and the practice, cultivated over time and rarely comfortable, of placing it there. The private writing, the chosen person, the inner circle of the ring where the direction is inward, the structured reckoning with difficulty as opposed to its public rehearsal. And the paradox resolves cleanly once this is seen. The composed person is not saying less about their difficulties because they feel less. They are not more fortunate, not built from different material, not free from the weight of what life puts in their path. They feel what you feel. Sometimes they feel it more acutely than the chronic complainer does, precisely because they have not been rehearsing the helpless frame that slowly numbs. They feel the raw thing, but they understand, whether consciously or through years of learning it the hard way, that where they voice that feeling matters, that the channel shapes the outcome, that the private reckoning moves the feeling forward and the public performance loops it back, that saying the thing to the person who can do something about it is an act of agency, and saying the same thing to the person who can do nothing is an act of status spending that returns nothing. And when they do speak, when they do disclose, when they say, "This is hard, this is more than I expected, this is something I am carrying," that disclosure arrives in the listener's perception with its full weight, unmuddied by repetition, unfiltered by the static of all the previous times. Clear signal, the room turns toward them, not because they performed suffering better, but because they kept the channel open for when it mattered. You do not have to decide anything tonight about how you will live with this. That is not what this night was for. The mind at this hour, softening toward sleep, was not made for deciding. It was made for receiving, for taking in and allowing understanding to settle into the places where it will be useful later. without the self-consciousness of effort or the interference of urgency. What was offered here tonight does not need to be held tightly. It does not need to be memorized or arranged into a list or carried anywhere. The understanding, if it is the right understanding for you, will simply be there when it is needed. Waiting in the dark the way things do when the mind has met them and allowed them to go still. Let us gather, for a moment, what we have met tonight. We met the alarm that sounds too often, and the way the listener's ear eventually stops rushing toward it. We met the room that begins to feel heavier than expected, and the quiet realization that the source of the heaviness is already visible to everyone in the room but the person generating it. We met the invisible receipt, the cost paid in others' private reassessment that never arrives as feedback, never comes as a note or a conversation or a correction, but accumulates in the small adjustments of who is consulted and who is invited, and whose voice, when it finally rises, is heard as signal versus noise. We met the two channels of human status, the dominance that coerces, and the prestige that is freely given, freely withheld. And we understood that prestige goes to the person others want to learn from, want to be near, want to carry something of. Chronic complaint does not demonstrate the thing prestige is looking for. It demonstrates its absence. We met Rotter's insight about locus of control, the simple, powerful difference between the grammar of agency and the grammar of powerlessness. The way that they did this to me, and this always happens, and there is nothing I can do, answer the listener's silent question, is this person in control of their life, or is their life in control of them? With the most costly answer available. We met Brad Bushman's finding at Case Western, the discovery that venting anger over a punching bag while thinking about the person who had wronged you did not make the anger go down. It made the anger go up. Gasoline on a fire. The body repeats what it enacts. The mind deepens what it rehearses. We met co-rumination, Amanda Rose's careful observation of the trap that is simultaneously bonding and harmful. The way that going over and over the same difficulty with someone who loves you can feel like intimacy and can, without contradiction, be making things worse. The same behavior, two outcomes, both real, both running at once. We met the hippocampus story and the honest version of it. The difference between what went viral and what Robert Sapolsky's actual body of work on chronic stress and glucocorticoids describes. The real finding, which is serious and complicated and does not reduce to a headline. The importance of telling the difference between what the research actually showed and what the internet wanted the research to say. We met the two kinds of complaint Robin Kowalski mapped. The instrumental, directed at a fixer, specific, with a proposed resolution, a form of agency. And the expressive, aimed at a witness, repeated, resolved at nothing, the form that spends the thing it cannot afford to spend. We met James Pennebaker's quiet rooms, 15 to 20 minutes of private writing. The pen moving across paper with no audience in mind, the discovery that processing arrives through structured private engagement with difficulty, not through its public performance. We met Susan Silk and Barry Goldman's rings. Comfort flowing in, distress flowing out. The radical simplicity of orienting help toward need rather than toward the nearest available person. We met Epictetus, writing in captivity, arriving at the thing that captivity had made unmistakably clear to him. Some things are in your power, some things are not. And the entire project of a human life, if there is such a project, might be the ongoing practice of learning the difference and investing accordingly. We met Marcus Aurelius in his private notebooks, processing, not performing. A man who understood without ever having heard the vocabulary for it that the channel matters as much as the content. And we met the paradox that resolves it all. That saying less makes each word heavier. That keeping the channel clear is what preserves its capacity to carry what matters. That composure is not suppression, and not coldness, and not the denial of feeling. It is the knowledge that where you put the feeling changes what the feeling becomes, and how it is received, and whether it moves through or stays. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to carry it into tomorrow with any particular intention. If one thing settled quietly somewhere in you tonight, if one piece of this found a place to rest, that is enough. That is more than enough. Understanding does not require effort to stick. The right things have a way of staying without being made to. And whatever it is that you were carrying when you found your way to this night, the weight that made the idea of lying down and listening to someone talk about something quietly true feel, for some reason, like exactly the right thing for this particular darkness, that weight was not nothing. It was real. It brought you here, which means it is already doing something other than just sitting heavy. That is worth knowing, that the fact of looking at a difficulty, even from this strange sideways angle, even half asleep, even without any clear intention of doing something specific with it, that looking is itself a motion. A small one, invisible, but things begin with it. The night does not ask anything more of you than this. It never did. Let the room hold what it holds. Let the dark be the size it is, which is just this room, just this particular quiet. Let the body go on, doing what it already knows how to do when you stop asking it to do other things. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.